It all began at the computer of Assistant Curator Christine Mao, who developed her original concept with the input of Library Director Timothy Walsh.
And when you jam those boxes in, because they had sloped bottoms, it jams up.
And an elaborate formation of walls resembling the White House resulted. Sturdily constructed like a real house with wood and drywall.
You're gonna hit this inside corner wallet?
Come on, man.
A log cabin facade was added to give the exhibit an authentic period atmosphere.
Oh, well, let me do something.
As designer, Christine oversaw every detail of the exhibit's construction.
Not many school kids my age.
And staff members contributed their expertise.
Can't you find anything better to do with your time?
How's that?
With the construction well in hand, the placement of cases, exhibit elements, and borrowed historical objects got underway. But as always, serious work can be fun.
Well, I don't think you're doing much good, Julie. We're sitting here.
It's not moving. We're not like there.
I'm stuck.
Okay, let's
Oh,
get
no.
this. Can you push in that corner there? I want to pull it. There we go.
You're going, you're going?
Well, wait, we should
little
plug that
down.
in. Plug that in.
Oh,
Uh-oh.
Gotta go a
That's
little
a
farther
plug.
to plug it in.
yeah, sure.
You gonna hold that one? You guys
Okay.
hold that one so we can brace against it.
Man.
Oh, God, what if they... Oh, no. It's gonna be like...
Like Star Wars.
Batman.
Star Wars, they're in the garbage chute thing.
Where's Eleanor going now? Over
She
here?
goes back in that, way back in that corner.
There's room for her and...
Well, this case has to get slid down now.
Oh. How does that?
You don't want to know.
Oh, there's
We got
Millie.
there and it was canceled. I mean, it's not
Why?
canceled. The guy didn't show up.
Oh, gee whiz. I know, it's kind of... You never know there. Are you selling these?
Yeah.
And what is it for all different colors on it?
Additional staff members were needed to add spit and polish.
Great, thanks.
Never trust the carpet marks.
Although some shied away from publicity.
Get over there for me.
The American people long have been fascinated by the lives of our presidents and their families. Until the 1930s, citizens could visit the White House on New Year's Day to shake hands with the Commander-in-Chief. But of course, the situation is a bit different today. Behind the public spaces of the White House are private stories. The tradition of entertaining at the White House began in 1800 when Abigail Adams hosted 2 receptions for the ladies of Washington. Many social occasions have provided opportunities for American leaders to become acquainted. Though the office of the presidency was designed to differ from the royal monarchies of old Europe, Some of its ceremonies assume regal proportions. Presidential weddings are special occasions attended by both family, friends, and famous faces. Presidents John Tyler, Grover Cleveland, and Woodrow Wilson were wed while in office, while presidential daughters Nellie Grant, Alice Roosevelt, Jesse and Eleanor Wilson, and Tricia Nixon all were married in the White House. President Johnson's wife, Lady Bird, wore this dress to the White House wedding of their daughter, Linda, in 1967. The president's job has been called a glorious burden, and there aren't too many people who could manage the complexities and pressures associated with it. Being responsible for the armed forces, the appointments of judges and cabinet officers, the enactment of treaties and legislation, and reporting to Congress, as well as trying not to make mistakes that will be reported in every newspaper across the globe, doesn't leave much time for home and family. This chair was used by President Herbert Hoover during his term at the White House. From 1789 to 1841, the United States solidified as a nation, its citizens moving west to open up new territories that eventually would be admitted to the Union. Though this period was mostly one of peace, with men and women working for reforms in education and slavery, war with America's original inhabitants soon would come. Among the exhibit's rarest items, this cup and saucer, dating from the 1790s, were used by George and Martha Washington during America's first presidential administration. And these pieces of lace were taken from Mrs. Washington's wedding dress. This brocade vest, dating from the 1790s, was worn by second President John Adams, whose wife Abigail walked America's corridors of political power wearing this shoe and its twin, now housed at the Quincy Historical Society in Massachusetts. Author of the Declaration of Independence and third president, Thomas Jefferson wore these tiny eyeglasses, which were made in 1806 by Philadelphia optometrist John McAllister. Unfortunately, this brilliant founding father also was a man of his times. To the right of the spectacles are papers listing the slaves that he owned. Fourth President James Madison helped conceive the Bill of Rights and founded the University of Virginia with his friend Thomas Jefferson. His wife, the outgoing Dolly Madison, is one of America's best-known early First Ladies. Fifth President James Monroe, best known for establishing the Monroe Doctrine, a policy declaring the United States off-limits to foreign powers, wore this waistcoat at formal occasions while living in Virginia. This miniature portrait of Monroe was painted while he and his wife, Eliza, were living in Paris in 1796. During their time in France, Eliza wore these slippers to social functions, while this miniature Staffordshire tea set belonged to their daughter, Maria. The only president's son to follow in his father's footsteps, John Quincy Adams took office in 1825. His son, Charles Francis, gave him this telescope so he could enjoy his favorite hobby of stargazing. These leather riding breeches dating from 1800 were worn by Adams years before his presidency. The first president born in a log cabin, rugged Andrew Jackson, used this porcelain plate and silver flatware during his administration in the early 1830s. It is believed that these eyeglasses belonged to his adopted son, Andrew Jackson Donaldson. Martin Van Buren was the first president to be born a U.S. citizen. Fascinated with technology, he owned an early coffee maker and had a stove in his modern home, which also included a flush toilet with a blue bowl. War hero William Henry Harrison proved a tragic president, lasting only 31 days before dying of pneumonia he had contracted during his inaugural speech. This cup and saucer are from the set used in the White House during his all-too-brief administration. From the 1840s until the end of the century, much of the American populace believed in the concept of manifest destiny, that God had willed them to push toward the Pacific to claim the land as their own. The Indian Wars, conflict with Mexico, and the Civil War bloodied the landscape from one coast to the other. John Tyler became president upon the death of William Henry Harrison. He and his wife, Julia Gardner Tyler, were both born into wealthy Virginia families. This hair brooch contains strands of President Tyler's hair. When John Tyler was not renominated in 1844, the Democrats instead chose James K. Polk to head their party. Polk gave this watch to his wife Sarah on their 24th wedding anniversary in 1848. A hero of the Mexican-American War, Zachary Taylor served only 16 months as president before dying of a sudden illness. Taylor used this silver goblet, which was passed on to his son, Richard. Millard Fillmore became president upon the death of Zachary Taylor, serving out the remainder of the term until 1853. Fillmore used this Baptist hymnal, which he dated January 15, 1865. First Lady Abigail Fillmore wore these slippers the day she wed Millard in 1826. This doll belonged to their daughter, Mary Abigail. An inexperienced leader, Franklin Pierce developed policies that created national instability. His views on slavery and westward expansion helped to bring about the Civil War. First Lady Jane Pierce may have used this fan at Washington social functions, and this brooch, dating from 1830, was worn by her. Born in 1791 on the Pennsylvania frontier, James Buchanan, known as a great compromiser, attempted to avert civil war and left office just as the conflict was about to explode. He is the only American president who never married. Buchanan wrote this letter to his niece, Harriet Lane, who served as White House hostess during his presidency. In 1860, the Prince of Wales gave these shirt studs to the president, a gift to his nephew and personal secretary, James Buchanan II. Considered by many to be America's greatest president, Abraham Lincoln served during the four most harrowing years in our nation's history. Dedicated to restoring the Union, he also authored the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves. When Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd, moved from Springfield, Illinois after his election, this drapery was among the items purchased at the sale. This framed photograph is of Lincoln's dog, Fido, who did not make the trip to Washington. The heights of the Lincoln grandchildren are marked on this door panel, which was taken from the home of Abe and Mary's son, Robert. After Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson attempted to carry out his predecessor's Reconstruction policies, but met with staunch opposition from radical Republicans who wanted to punish the South. He was impeached after dismissing Secretary of War Stanton without first gaining Senate approval, but was acquitted by one vote. During his presidency, Johnson wore this shirt and used this walking stick. Johnson's wife, Eliza, wore this shawl during the same period, when the couple used this salt cellar at the White House. Jefferson Davis was the first and only president of the Confederate States of America. He frequently used this eyeglass polisher made for him by an anonymous girl because his eyesight was so poor. This replica of a Civil War Confederate uniform was worn by Jefferson Davis, Jr. Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant, a politically inexperienced president who later fell into debt, used this personalized leather wallet. Spurred by the Industrial Revolution, the United States became a leader in agriculture and manufacturing during the next 40 years. New machines, inventions, and modes of transportation led to heavy investment in big business enterprises. A major general in the Civil War, Rutherford B. Hayes, served as president from 1877 to 1881. Although she was known as Lemonade Lucy for refusing to serve liquor in the White House, First Lady Lucy Webb Hayes was an excellent hostess. For social occasions, President Hayes donned this top hat, while their daughter Fanny wore this dress to a costume ball. The final log cabin president, James Garfield, was a Civil War veteran, distinguished scholar, and able administrator, who who tragically was assassinated by a disappointed office seeker after only 6 months in the White House. Actually, it wasn't the assassin's bullet that killed Garfield, but an infection caused by inept physicians. Garfield and his wife, Lucretia, used this plate during their brief tenure at the White House. These studs made from silver quarters belonged to President Garfield. These mourning ribbons were worn by 3 of Garfield's sons at his 1881 funeral. Garfield's successor, the fashionable Chester A. Arthur, was decidedly pro-American, signing a federal law restricting Chinese immigration and dedicating the Washington Monument during the last days of his administration in 1885. This silver pillbox was used by President Arthur, while this miniature mug probably was an item from the 1880 election. Arthur's wife, Ellen, had died shortly before he was elected president. His sister, Mary Arthur McElroy, who served as White House hostess, is seen in this original steel engraving and wore these shoes to social functions. Grover Cleveland was a unique commander-in-chief on 2 counts. He was the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms and the only one actually married in the White House to the young and beautiful Frances Folsom during his first term in 1886. While decorating the White House, Mrs. Cleveland sent this fabric sample to Baltimore. This silver dresser tray belonged to their daughter Ruth Cleveland, whose nickname of Baby Ruth was bestowed upon the popular candy bar. Benjamin Harrison served as president between Grover Cleveland's 2 terms, and he wasn't expected to win when running against him in 1889. This large club-like cane was a gift to Harrison in 1892. Harrison's wife, Carolyn, painted this calling card case, which held these cards. Of course, the president also passed out his own. The last Civil War veteran to become president, William McKinley, served during the controversial Spanish-American War and tragically was assassinated early in his 2nd term in 1901. Ironically, he had just given his lucky red carnation, a flower he always had worn during his political years, to a little girl at the World's Fair in Buffalo, New York. This meerschaum pipe belonged to President McKinley, while this parasol was used by his wife, Ida. An avid outdoorsman, Theodore Roosevelt served as president for 2 terms, declined to run for re-election in 1909, and then lost in the election of 1912 when he decided to give it another go as the candidate of the Progressive or Bull Moose Party. His protection of the environment and the public interest against big business made him beloved to many. Roosevelt's wife, Edith, used this guest book at the White House. Roosevelt hated the nickname Teddy, but this moniker forever was attached to a famous toy bear after Roosevelt refused to shoot a small cub during one of his big game hunts. This is one of the first teddy bears ever made. A successful lawyer and cabinet member in the Roosevelt administration, William Howard Taft ironically ran against his former boss in the 1912 election, when Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party split the Republican vote, allowing Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats to win. Prior to his presidency, Taft used this first aid kit while living in the Philippines. This loving cup commemorated the silver wedding anniversary of Taft and his wife Helen during a White House garden party in June 1911. A distinguished academic and progressive politician, Woodrow Wilson attempted to make the world safe for democracy during World War I. Ultimately, his fanatical devotion to peace led to a stroke, and his second wife, Edith, served as unofficial first female president until the end of his 2nd term in 1921. President Wilson's tailor made this cutaway jacket and vest for his wedding to Edith on December 18, 1915. The economic prosperity of the 1920s was ended by the Wall Street stock market crash of October 1929, an event that marked the beginning of the Great Depression, a disaster that lasted until United States involvement in World War II After the Allies were victorious against Germany and Japan, the American economy again prospered. One of the most popular men ever elected president, Warren G. Harding, also became one of the most controversial and scandal-ridden. Troubled by his associates' illegal activities and his own indiscretions, he died of a stroke halfway through his term in 1923. President Harding owned these silk pajamas, as well as these golf balls and letter opener. The pillbox was used by Mrs. Florence Harding, who may have needed an aspirin or two when she learned of her husband's troubles. When President Harding died suddenly, Vice President Calvin Coolidge was sworn in by his father, a notary public whom he was visiting at the family farm in Vermont. Known as a do-nothing president, Coolidge let big business boom and ignored the out-of-control stock market. This silver vase is engraved with the ode, "The Open Door," a poem written in memory of the late Calvin Coolidge Jr. by his mother, Grace. During the early 1930s, Mrs. Coolidge donated this driving cap, worn by her husband, to the Girl Scout thrift shop. A successful mining engineer, food relief administrator, and U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover's presidency was tragically marred by the onset of the Great Depression shortly after he took office in 1929. Following his term, he eventually returned to a life of public service, aided by his wife, Lou Henry, who was an avid home movie maker throughout her life. Mrs. Hoover purchased this 18th century Dutch wardrobe in Philadelphia, and it graced the Oval Drawing Room on the second floor of the White House during the Hoover administration. These items all were used by President Hoover, and this tiny dress featuring his doodles was made for their granddaughter, Margaret. Born into the Eastern aristocracy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was stricken with polio while in his late 30s. In 1933, he defeated Herbert Hoover during the height of the Great Depression, beginning a 4-term administration that ended only with his death during the closing moments of World War II, rarely allowing himself to be seen or photographed in a way that would indicate his disability. FDR was able to walk only with the aid of these leg braces and a cane. He used this cocktail set both at the White House and at the family home in Hyde Park, New York. His wife, Eleanor, a very active and outspoken First Lady, perhaps carried this pistol in the glove box of her car when she traveled without the Secret Service. FDR's beloved Scottish Terrier, Fala, wore this miniature Navy uniform during World War II. A former haberdasher and county supervisor, Harry S. Truman became president when the long-ailing FDR passed away in April 1945. With only 4 months' experience as vice president, he took the reins to complete America's participation in World War II, deciding to use the atomic bomb against Japan instead of invading. Truman's wife, Bess, was instrumental in furthering his political career. Truman was famous for his terrible ties. In his own words, he put them on just to get a loud protest from Bess and Margie, their daughter. This particular tie must be among his most hideous. The Cold War began as soon as hot World War II ended, and the fear of nuclear annihilation was never greater than it was during the 1950s and early 1960s. Economic prosperity continued, but turmoil over civil and women's rights and the Vietnam War was at a peak during the late 60s and early 70s. After the Cold War ended with the fall of the Soviet Union during the 1980s, an economic upswing occurred in recent years. A West Point graduate, Dwight D. Eisenhower became a 5-star general and World War II hero before his election to the presidency in 1953, serving 2 terms as a relaxed, outwardly happy leader. Known as Ike, he loved to cook, paint, play golf, and spend time with his wife, Mamie, who hailed from Boone, Iowa. This was Ike's personal camera that he used for many years while traveling the globe. This vase was a gift to Mamie from their son, John. Born into a prominent Massachusetts family, John F. Kennedy became famous for his World War II heroism before being elected to the Senate. The youngest man ever to win the presidency, Kennedy, both charismatic and controversial, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas in November 1963, less than 3 years into his term. His wife, Jacqueline, was one of America's most elegant and beloved first ladies. This doll was given to their daughter Caroline by an Indian ambassador, while this toy rocket belonged to their son, John Jr. A supporter of FDR, Lyndon B. Johnson served as U.S. Representative and Senator before being thrust into the presidency upon the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. His progressive programs involving civil rights and education were marred by his increasing commitment to the Vietnam War. His wife, Lady Bird, has been actively involved in projects benefiting children and the environment. This jacket, purchased at Sears, was worn by President Johnson at Camp David, and he often wore this hat at their ranch in Texas. A World War II veteran, communist hunting senator, and vice president, Richard M. Nixon became the only president ever to resign from office after the Watergate scandal of the early 1970s. After leaving the White House, he and his wife Pat lived another 20 years, and although he proved himself a prolific and eloquent author, Nixon was still shadowed by controversy. Nixon wore this jacket at Camp David and at his home in San Clemente, California. These picnic dishes, left unwashed after their last use, were used by the Nixon family. These ballet slippers belonged to the Nixons' daughter, Tricia. The personable and intelligent Gerald R. Ford became president when Richard Nixon resigned in 1974. Although he made strides in the Middle East peace process and the limitation of nuclear weapons, many Americans resented his pardon of Nixon and failed to re-elect him in 1976. This is one of President Ford's many pipes, and while he enjoyed this pastime, his wife Betty loved to talk on the CB radio, a fad of the 1970s. These are some of Mrs. Ford's possessions, two of which sport her CB handle, First Mama. Raised on a Georgia peanut farm, Jimmy Carter served in World War II and was elected governor before winning the presidency in 1976. A champion of the people, he worked to improve education, employment, the environment, foreign relations, and arms control. But a lengthy economic crisis and a hostage ordeal with Iran damaged his popularity. Since leaving the White House, he and his wife Rosalind have made many contributions to charities and humanitarian causes. President Carter wore this uniform jacket during his stint in the Navy. A likable film actor who became president of the Screen Actors Guild in 1951, Ronald Reagan moved from being an FDR Democrat to one of the most popular Republican presidents of the 20th century. Possessing a disarming wit and warm personality, he created an image that millions of Americans admired during the early 1980s.